It'll be as big as Texas, apparently. New Zealand is simply ripe for oil and gas development. We could all be fantastically rich. That's one scenario anyway. The other is that fracking, the process of extracting oil and gas, could cause earthquakes and contaminate our drinking water. So which is true, payday or doomsday? Guyon Espiner's been investigating.
The east coast of the North Island. The first place in the world to see the new day. And one of the last places in New Zealand to see any major industrial development. Some are quite happy to keep it that way, especially if the alternative is this. Locals are worried about the arrival of the oil and gas industry and the modern mining technique of fracking. They're coming together to share their concerns.
It's an assault on the earth itself.
Shut it down.
So, two big rigs here
Yep.
and here, and you don't get to know about it.
And you don't get to know about it.
In Taranaki, they've experienced on the west coast what might be heading east. Sarah Roberts' family farm is next door to 3 wells owned by Canadian-based company Tag Oil. Last year, she became concerned about the drilling.
They told me that the consequences of having rigs are minor, so therefore they don't legally have to tell anyone about them except for the person whose land is on. Now,
Oil rigs have been a way of life for this teacher and farmer, growing up in the oil and gas capital of New Zealand. But what worried Sarah Roberts were some effects she had never experienced before.
there was this funny smell in the air and it smelt like nail polish remover. And our share milker told us he was a bit worried because he'd been trying to walk back from the cow shed to the house and the ground had been shaking. He wasn't sure what it was, but it went on for quite some time.
Both councils described those activities as having minor environmental effects.
Sarah Roberts wasn't told, but she'd learned from the media that Tag Oil had been fracking right next door.
And I feel like all of a sudden this stuff is coming to light and it's not a very good picture.
The more she learned, the more concerned she became, concerned enough to call this public meeting in Stratford to ask for answers.
Everything we've read about it and everything we know about the sites now tell us that there's a potential for it to be contaminated. If there's things that have been spilt up on the site or put on the site when they put their drilling wastes out, then it's got potential to end up in our water because we're so close.
While the regional council has released tests saying the local water is not contaminated, Sarah Roberts isn't convinced and she stopped drinking the water from the farm supply. The process she's concerned about is called hydraulic fracturing or fracking. It involves pumping a high-pressure mixture of chemicals, sand and up to 300,000 litres of fresh water deep into the earth to fracture the rock and release the oil and gas. Fracking has the oil industry very excited.
Then you go to the end of that hole and you start fracturing it. Crack, and you do it again. You crack, crack, and you do it all the way along that whole thing. You've just busted the out of a kilometre of the stuff.
Just look at this company-produced video to see how enthusiastic Tag Oil's Chief Operating Officer, Drew Cadenhead, is about fracking on the East Coast.
It's on the forefront of what we're doing, down on the East Coast in New Zealand right now. We're just not waiting for it, like I said, to get into reservoirs. We're going down and taking it before it's ready to go out.
Tag Oil, backed by more than $100 million from its Canadian partner Apache, has identified targets to search for oil and gas over 1.7 million acres of land on the East Coast. Sarah Roberts says her experience should have them worried.
I think they need to look at it really, really closely. I think they need to look at the regulations really closely.
The world has been looking more closely at fracking, mostly because of the experience in America. The recent documentary Gasland raised fears that fracking could contaminate water supplies with methane to dramatic effect.
Whoa, Jesus Christ.
The oil industry claims these cases are caused by methane naturally seeping into the water supply, but concerns are great enough to have seen fracking banned in France, Bulgaria and parts of Australia and America. In New Zealand, it's going to be used more and more. 60 fracking operations have been done in Taranaki in the last 2 decades, but 30 more are set to go ahead in just the next few years. Now Tag Oil wants to take fracking to the East Coast. Its own documents describe the region as the Texas of the South, and say it's literally leaking oil and gas. That sort of talk is frightening the locals.
It does feel a bit like a David and Goliath situation where we don't have any experience in this stuff and these companies have bottomless pockets.
Gisborne District Councillor Manu Caddy wants a moratorium on fracking on the east coast. It's not just the international evidence that worries him, but what's happened in Taranaki.
We don't have a history of it here like they do. I guess our environments are potentially more pristine, and if there's anywhere in the country when you think of environmental problems, you think of Taranaki and the legacy of some of the industries that they've had over there.
We have not found any evidence of direct groundwater contamination. We found of gas.
International fracking expert Avner Vengosh visited Gisborne on a New Zealand lecture tour.
I'm more worried about the natural occurring brine or formation water that comes.
He and colleagues from Duke University in the United States studied 60 private drinking water wells in New York and Pennsylvania. 51 had methane in them, but concentrations were substantially higher closer to drilling sites.
We see a direct link between the shale gas drilling, hydrofracking, and presence of this methane in drinking water wells.
The oil industry believes Professor Vengosh is too alarmist with his warnings about fracking. They suggested we talk to another academic, Dr. Rosalind Archer of Auckland University, a petroleum mining specialist who has also done contract work for New Zealand and international oil companies. Is fracking safe?
Is fracking safe? It's a process that's been around since 1947. It's evolved a lot. It's something I wouldn't object to if it was being done on my land.
Is it the same as it was in 1947?
No, the frack jobs done in 1947 were done with gasoline gelled with napalm. I wouldn't want that done on my land.
But nowadays it's changed?
Nowadays it's much cleaner. Fracturing treatments are done with water, with some chemical additives, but most of the chemicals are things that you would find in your kitchen or your laundry or your swimming pool to some degree.
Most of the fracking jobs in New Zealand have been done in Taranaki, and nowadays they run from mobile control units like this one. The industry says because they drill so deep, there is very little risk of contaminating the water supply. While the fresh water source is less than 1 kilometre beneath the earth, the fracking operations occur much deeper than that, often 3 kilometres down. So there is usually at least 2 kilometres of rock between the fracking operation and the drinking water.
The deeper the job is, that puts you further and further away from shallow drinking water aquifers. So in terms of contamination, yes, the more separation you can have between the layer you're fracturing and the drinking water zones, the better.
But we found evidence that in October of 2005, a fracking job at the Manutahi well in Taranaki was done with just 257 metres, separating the fracking from the fresh water level. Is that something we should be worried about, to do a fracking job that close to a water source?
In the list of fracking jobs in New Zealand, in terms of a review, that would be one that I would red flag to really double check that everything made sense geologically.
During the fracking, you can see causing the different fracture to open along this formation, and the gas will release into the well and pump to the surface.
Professor Vengosh says the red flag can go up no matter how deep the drilling is, because fracking can increase the chances of methane finding its way up through the rock to contaminate the water.
The question is not the length in terms of kilometers, the question is the hydrological connectivity between the deep formation and the shallow aquifers.
So in simple terms, there are pathways that the methane can travel up and get into the water supply,
correct,
regardless of the distance from that water supply.
Right. Our study suggests that there are pathways like fracture.
But the oil industry says water contamination is very unlikely unless a well is poorly constructed, and they say that standards in New Zealand are among the best in the world.
These two layers are cemented together, these two are cemented together, this one will go all the way to the bottom. So there are multiple layers of steel and cement protecting the rock wall and the various geological structures all the way up.
The oil industry bosses wouldn't be interviewed for this story. Instead, they put up the head of their lobby group, David Robinson of the Petroleum Exploration and Production Association. Why aren't the industry leaders sitting where you're sitting and talking to us?
This is an industry topic, and it's the role of it was my role to represent the industry on industry topics.
Are they worried about talking to the media though?
This industry's got absolutely nothing to hide.
Although getting answers about fracking isn't always easy. How often is it going to be used?
I think hydraulic fracturing will be used when it's required to make those wells produce. So that will be dependent on each well and the conditions that each well has.
Okay, well let's talk about numbers then, because there are 30 potentially fracking operations planned now, aren't there?
There will be a number of wells that are fractured in this region.
Well, is it your understanding that those numbers are about right?
So there'll be a large number of wells that are fractured. It will be commensurate with the size of the industry that we have in New Zealand.
So why has it been banned in other countries like France and Bulgaria and parts of the United States? Are you sitting here telling me that there's just no problem?
Nothing is without risk. The facts of hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas extraction here in New Zealand is that it has been here for 20 years. It's been done under very, very controlled conditions, and it has been proven that there is no risk to the water and there is no risk of seismic activity.
But as you'll soon see, overseas that hasn't always been the case.
Coming up.
If we look at Canterbury, we didn't even know those fault lines were there. They destroyed a city.
And that is of concern.
That's next on 60 Minutes.
Good evening, updating 3 News this hour. Air New Zealand's grounded 11 ATR 500 planes after cracks were found around the cockpit window of one of them. The sole survivor from the Bluff fishing tragedy has thanked his saviour, but the search for the 4 still missing has been called off.
And an array of All Blacks past and present joined the family of Jock Hobbs to farewell one of New Zealand rugby's favourite sons. We'll have more news next hour.
New Comfort. Do you know how long it keeps clothes smelling fresh?
How long?
Well, it goes on
and on and on.
Just one small cap of Comfort gives all this freshness even after 14 days in the wardrobe.
We've just been voted New Zealand's #1 value for money brand. But we're not stopping there. Our mission for impossibly low prices goes on. Oh, is that the floor? Look out! Oh no, it's a line on the wall. Oh, that was the floor. Pack and save. Our policy, New Zealand's lowest food prices.
Imagine paying off your mortgage faster while still managing to save for a family holiday. And having money set aside for surprise vet bills.